Good morning, everyone. I'm glad to see that everyone's up early this morning. Now we're going to be able to start right on time. There was actually a rumor that it was going to start an hour early this morning. This was a vile rumor. The starting date is not 10:30, has always been 10:30. Now, I'd like to ask you not to be intimidated by this poster right here. If you haven't done anything wrong, there's nothing to worry about. Now, some of you might remember this banner from the conference last year. This was a theme for the Hope Conference, and this panel and REcon and what I have to say has nothing to do with hope. It has more to do with fear. Now, I'm sure all of you are aware that the internet is in a constant state of flux. It's changing its content and behavior at an alarming speed. Big Brother is watching over these changes to ensure that all goes well. But our next speaker seems to think that you can avoid the omnipresent surveillance of our benevolent leader. Now, the internet is now crawling with pedophiles, pirates, peddlers, prostitutes, poor people, and plenty more. Our next speaker wishes to provide tools, techniques, and technology for these criminals to distribute anarchist propaganda in perfect anonymity. Remember, if you've done nothing wrong, you have nothing to hide. This speaker actually has a dubious past, which is probably filled with criminal activities, perverse acts of improper conduct, and alcoholism, I'm sure. I warn you that he will employ mind manipulation techniques to hypnotize you into a state of confusion by distorting the facts, omitting truths, and boldly lying to your face. I urge you not to let yourself be deceived by Adam Shostack.
Thank you, I think. So I'm here today to talk about free speech, to talk about technology, to talk about some of the ways that we may be able to preserve free speech, to enhance free speech. People in China, there have been over 200 bloggers arrested or sentenced for freedom of speech activities, for putting their opinions on, or for putting facts online. Some of those people were not actually making what we would consider to be political statements. They were doing things like sharing information about a new disease that may have crossed over from bird flu called SARS. They may have been sharing medical information, which is considered to be a state secret. And in Iran, people are being put in jail for expressing political views about the elections, the supposedly somewhat free elections. And so I'd like to tell you about a project I'm working on, get people thinking about the problems that are associated with it, and I'll talk first about some technology and then about how we might strengthen that technology. And I'd like to ask people to get involved. If these things are interesting to you, there's some projects I'm going to talk about where we need people to do research. We need people to write some code. And so that is my main reason to be here, is to find people who can do those things, who are interested in doing those things. I'm doing this work with a group called Spirit of America, who's a nonprofit based in the United States. They do a lot of work bringing school books and clothing to school children right now in Iraq and Afghanistan. And they host the first blogging service so that people in Iran can blog. They've translated blogging tools into Persian. And we're also working on creating an anonymous blogging service so that those people who would like to speak without including their name in their speech can do so. And we'd like to make that as secure as possible, as easy to use as possible. Again, this came out yesterday, that China had been feeding human antibiotics to birds in an effort to reduce various forms of bird flu. Now what that does is it creates resistant strains of these infections. And once these strains are resistant, we have one less drug that we can use to resist them when they're affecting human beings, when they're killing humans. And China did not talk about this. It was a secret. And because it was a secret, doctors, Toronto had a major SARS problem. Doctors did not know what drugs had already been used. And so their choices of drugs would be wrong because this information was suppressed. So I'm going to talk a lot about politics. This is not solely a political issue. It is not solely something, oh, people in that other country have chosen not to have free speech. You know, that's their leader's choice, that's their choice. It is also a matter of public health and safety around the world when information like this is suppressed. So who's involved in sort of the broader project? There's a group called the Committee to Protect Bloggers. There's the Citizens Lab at the University of Toronto. There's a group I'm working with, Spirit of America. There's individuals. Some of them are techies, people who write code. Ben Hasselton, for example, wrote a tool called the Circumventor, which is a very nice tool. It allows you to, if you live in a repressive nation and you have a friend who does not, they can set up a circumventor for you, which is a unique URL. You access it over HTTPS, and it proxies out to the internet for you. That's very cool. We'd like more people who can write tools like that. We have some local experts on China and Iran. But there are a lot of countries where free speech is under attack. There's a lot of places where we could use local experts, people who understand the situation, people who understand the language, people who can help us communicate. We'd also love to hear from people who would like to blog and are scared to. What is holding them back? What do they believe is the most important tools that they could use? Because as we encourage people to express themselves, we have to respond to the fears. We have to teach them what's actually, what the threats may be. And we also have to keep in mind as we do this, and this is a serious point which I will come back to. People are going to jail, people are being beaten when we provide bad information about their privacy. If they put their name on their blog, they may well expect the police to come and talk to them, to come and beat them. If, on the other hand, we tell them that we can safely protect them, then we're wrong. I think we bear some moral culpability for that. And we don't often talk about the moral issues that the technology includes, but I think it's important when we tell people, you can do this and be safe, that we're right. And that if we tell them, you can do this and here are the issues, that may be a much better thing to say. Some of the big issues that we're dealing with are, what do the real attackers do? How do the police in China actually track down the 200 bloggers whom they have arrested? In Iran, the bloggers who have been arrested, who have been sentenced to sometimes 2 and 5 years in jail, according to Human Rights Watch this week, they're being denied access to doctors as well. They were using their real name. They are very courageous people to use their real name to speak out to speak their minds, and they're being made to suffer for it by the Iranian regime. So in talking to people who know those folks, they've said that they chose to use their real name knowing it was a risk. They've said that they believe that they are more credible having actually put their name on their blog. And that's a fine thing. I have enormous respect for that decision. But there may be other people who would like to speak out, who are scared to, who look at what happened and say, I have a family, how can I do this to them? So the question of what people want, the Citizens Lab group in Toronto is putting together a survey to ask people, what do they want? There are technical issues. Do you have a computer on which you can install a client? If you have a client, does the presence of that client, for example, a Tor client, on your computer at home indicate sufficient guilt that you can be thrown in jail? If you choose to make your posts unintelligible to a network monitoring system, is that just as bad as critiquing the regime? Because clearly you have something to hide. And that something to hide in some places may be enough to put you in jail. They may not be working on Western standards of guilt and innocence. What does concealment mean to the secret police? So very roughly, we're working on figuring out what to build. We're still in the technology and tools part of this. Once we have that, we'll go get some money and build and operate things. And that probably will entail something involving a bunch of Tor servers, WordPress. Adopt a blog is something you can do today. Adopt a blog is a bunch of code which will mirror a blog in China. Right now it's been set up as Adopt a Chinese blog. And if that blog is shut down by the authorities, there's a mirror of it because you've installed it on your WordPress or movable type blog. And your normal visitors won't see it, but you provide a URL where people can see it. That's also important because it's not just posting to blogs which matters. It's not just the right to read, it's not just the right to speak freely, which is under attack. It is often the right to read, the right to read what other people have written is under serious attack as well. The Great Firewall of China is as much about preventing access to information as it is preventing people from providing information. This week, Microsoft Network announced a blogging service in Chinese. Very cool. They didn't announce, but people quickly discovered that there were certain dirty words you can't say on Microsoft Network's Chinese blog. Those words include freedom, they include democracy. So if you'd like to use those words, you can't use that service. If you'd like to go read a blog that includes those words and you're in China, you may not be able to access that system because they're preventing you from going to any website that's on a very large government list. And so Adopt a Blog allows you to provide two URLs. One is the regular one, and as soon as your regular one gets blocked, you provide a new URL. And so you're preserving the information, you're making it available to a broader set of readers. How many people, this is your first time in Montreal? How are y'all doing with the French? Easy? Hard? Imagine not trying to get into a restaurant and get yourself seated or buy a beer. Imagine trying to debug a Linux kernel device driver, doing something complicated, and the interface is not in English. That would be really challenging. Now think about the non-technical folks who are in China, who are in Iran, who are in Nepal, who are in many different countries in Africa, where they would like to be able to do this, and all of the documentation is in English. Now consider that if you make a mistake in using this technology, you may be thrown in jail. Translation is really, really important. It's not only translating documentation, it's translating user interfaces. Webosphere of America provided a blogging tool that works in Persian. And by that I mean every button in the WordPress system is labeled in Persian and English. Use shot up dramatically because people understood what they were doing. It gave them confidence in their ability to speak, in their ability to get things done in systems which, to the uninitiated, are challenging and hard. There's a couple of documents which are very important. The Electronic Frontier Foundation has a guide to blogging anonymously. This is mostly targeted at people in major Western democracies who have legal rights. And it tells you things like, don't use your real name in your blog. Don't mention your employer's name in your blog. If you can, password protect your blog so it doesn't show up in searches. These are really simple things, but when you look even within the United States, within Canada, within the UK, within France, there are bloggers who have been fired from their jobs because they provide too much personal information about themselves. They say things which are nominally derogatory or embarrassing or otherwise bad for their employer. And so the EFF has produced that blogging guide. Ethan Zuckerman, who's at the Berkman Center at Harvard, has produced an anonymous blogging guide. And it's a good start. It tells you how to use Tor to protect your blogging activity. It tells you what we know about how your blog might be tracked down. And I'll come back to that blogging guide in a minute. So going into some of the projects that I'd like to suggest, the first ones are really research projects. How are bloggers actually getting in trouble? If we talk a lot about threat models. If you don't have a good threat model, you don't have a good defensive system. Yeah, that's really true. And if we don't know if in a given country the police, the secret police, are using network monitoring technology, maybe they're just using Google. Maybe they've got a Google alert set up for Nepal blog, and it's emailing them when a new blog is set up mentioning Nepal. Maybe they're using secret police techniques. Maybe they have informers who they're paying. And I tell someone, hey, I've set up this blog to talk about local politics. They report it, and I'm in trouble. All of those are techniques that different organizations have in the past used. But what are they using today? The Chinese buy an awful lot of technology. One of the major human rights organizations, and I forget if it was Amnesty or Human Rights Watch, did a major report, several hundred pages, on technology companies in the West enabling the Great Firewall of China. The Chinese government shows up and says, we'd like some technology that can prevent people from getting to these sites and do word filtering and do this. And these companies are like, we can build that for you. It'll cost, well, about that much. Other countries don't have the same sort of budget. I was reading a blog in Nepal that's very critical of the government. And he says the government doesn't have the web savvy to understand what a blog is yet. And so he feels safe because there are very few computers in police headquarters. He understands that he's at risk because he's publicizing what he's doing, not only on the web, but also in traditional media. But different countries have very different risk profiles, and we need better information to understand how people might be put at risk. So I'll talk about those in some more detail. I'll talk about attacking the technology, and I'll analysis of things that we might build to defend against those attacks. So again, what's actually happening? I've been working with Ethan Zuckerman on his he's got a wiki-driven site to update his anonymous blogging guide, and at one point he said, he used an example of, if you have a Hotmail email account, then the foreign government would need to subpoena Microsoft to find out what your IP address is. Well, it turns out that that's incorrect. Hotmail puts a header into every email you send through Hotmail, which is X-originating IP. So you don't actually need a subpoena, you just need a mail program that will show you the full headers of an email. And that sort of mistake, it's important that people with different interests, with different bits of expertise, review these documents, contribute to these documents. There are a lot of wikis being used because everyone would like contributions from fairly different sectors. And so that particular one I went in and edited, we're confident that there are more. We understand that there are mistakes that people are making in these guides. We'd like to root them out as quickly as possible. You can spend 5 minutes, you can spend an hour, you can spend a lot of time. It's a very helpful thing, and we appreciate any work you can do. Textual analysis is a really neat thing. The choice of words which you write with, the order you put them in, your use of punctuation, the number of combinations of these things which are possible is staggering. As you get away from a basic 500-word vocabulary, the way in which everyone does that is very slightly different. How do you automate that? How do you actually, are people actually doing this? Yes. There was a book came out in the late 90s called Primary Colors, which was nominally by Anonymous. It was actually by Newsweek reporter Joe Klein. A lot of the reporting around the primary colors anonymity breach came with the story that someone had fed the text into a computer and gotten a result. That's not what happened. What actually happened, and Don Foster wrote a book called Author Unknown about how he did this. Don Foster is a professor of Shakespeare at the University of Rochester in New York. And what Don Foster does is he reads a lot. English professors get to do that. And in reading, he went through primary colors and said, well, let's create a list of possible suspects. There's only a limited number of people who would have this sort of access. It's going to be reporters. It's going to be senior presidential advisors. And so he made a list of people in those two groups, people who were no longer actively covering the campaign. And then what he did was he found writing samples for each of those people. And he noticed a bunch of unique words that were used in both Primary Colors and Joe Klein's Newsweek pieces. He then counted up some sentence lengths and said, yeah, I think this is a pretty darn good match. They're stylistically similar. Your writing style can give you away, not because of computer analysis, but because of pure human analysis. Now, if you look around the room and ask, how much of the gear that we have here is made in China because labor is very cheap? You might think that it's perfectly feasible to employ thousands of people doing this as part of an attack. It might also be possible to use an engine like Amazon's statistically improbable phrases. Have you seen this? People looked at this at all? It's a really cool thing in Amazon. When you go look at a book, it tells you what the least probable phrases in the book are. So it will say things like, you know, if I had written a book, it might put anonymous blogging, it might put bad guys intelligence agencies. It will pick unusual phrases out from the book and say, these are the most unusual phrases. And then it will tell you, these are the other books that had phrases like this in it. It's a cool feature. I'm not sure what really it's good for. But one thing it might be really good for is if I have a writing sample from you and I have an anonymous blog, I may be able to say, oh look, there's that really unusual turn of phrase that Alice uses. Bayesian analysis, we use it for anti-spam filters. Could we adapt it for writing similarity filters to say, this writing is too unique? There's an open question of what is too unique. I don't have a measure that I can give you and say, this writing, 0.72 unique. That writing, 0.2 unique. If I could do that, then the next step might be to integrate that into a blogging tool. So when you go to post, I can say, warning, your writing in this post is very unique. You might want to change these 4 phrases. That might be worthwhile. You might want to make your sentences shorter. You might want to remove commas. Whatever the distinguishing characteristics of the writing are, we don't know. And without knowing, we can't help people remove them. And so, I'd like to see research into this field. I'd like to see that both on a mathematical and academic research basis, and I'd like to see some people writing some code. Because once we have those things, we'll learn. I believe that the bad guys are way ahead. I believe that they understand this a lot better than we do, because they've been doing it. They've been finding things, and you read about CIA doing this sort of thing, inserting different commas into documents so they can track where they went. Writing is a unique thing, and we know very little about it compared to the public knows very little about it. It's a rich field for research. So I'd like to go into some technical challenges now. Are people familiar with Tor? Should I talk a little bit about Tor before? Raise your hand if you are not familiar with Tor. Okay, let me talk about Tor. Tor comes from the Onion Routing project. It's very similar to the Zero Knowledge Freedom software in that there are Tor servers and Tor clients. And the client routes your internet connectivity, your IP level traffic, through one or more Tor servers before putting it back onto the internet. So what that does is I'm sitting at the back of the room monitoring all the connections going out. Who's monitoring all the connections? Come on, anyone want to move into it? Come on. We know, thank you. We knew someone is. So someone in the room is monitoring everything with TCP dump, just out of idle curiosity. We know that. Maybe it's just a password sniffer, maybe it's not everything. But they can see all the connectivity. They can see when you go to Slashdot. They can see when you go to look at the New York Times. They can see when you look at the weather. Because the IP address is, you're going from here to there. What Tor does is it encapsulates that traffic. So instead of going from here to the New York Times, you go from here to a Tor server, and that Tor server will take the traffic and send it on to another one. That second one will send it to a third one, and then that third one will connect you to the New York Times, or it'll connect you to the adult entertainment site, or it'll connect you to indie media, or it'll connect you to a blog talking about how the Chinese government is oppressing people. And the fellow sitting in the back of the room running TCP dump can't see where you're going because the connections from the Tor client to the server are encrypted, and you've got this telescoping encryption feature. So that the first hop in your network can't see where you end up, and the last hop can't see where you're going. And this is cool technology. It used to be funded by the Naval Research Labs. It's now funded by the EFF. It's available at tor.eff.org. It's cool stuff. You should check it out. And so I've just talked a little bit about how it's really hard to tell where someone is going because that information is encrypted. So if we're the police, do we give up? If we're the folks who want to put people in jail, do we give up because it's encrypted? Heck no. So how to catch bloggers who are using Tor to publish? What you do is you just monitor all of the internet connectivity. You run TCP dump in the back of the ROM. And you record SYN packets that are coming out, right? Just when is a new connection starting up using Tor, because that's all you can really see. You can see where it came from. Did it come from an internet cafe? Did it come from an office? Did it come from a home? You record that, you record the time. Then what you do is you make a list of blogs that are interesting to you. And if you read a lot of blogs, you will notice that most of them post at least to the minute when a post came out. So you write that down. And then you correlate. You say at 10:32, a connection came from this internet cafe and a blog post went out. Now in China, if you operate a web publishing service, you have to register. If you operate a cyber cafe, you're required to have people sign in and show ID. So there are sign-in lists. I can find out that Bob showed up at the cafe at 10:30, and he shows up at 10:30 every Monday. And every Monday at 10:30, there's a post to a blog. May or may not be good evidence, but it may or may not matter to Bob when people show up at his door. If he's showing up at more random times at different cafes, you can still do the correlation. It's a little more work. You may end up harassing innocent people. You may not care. And so, it may not be particularly difficult, even if someone is using Tor, to figure out who they are. A lot of it is going to depend. Oh, one other bit. If you record the flow length, if I show up, I visit one site using Tor, I post my blog post, I go away, I can add in as information, you know, this Tor connection only had 400 bytes in it. It could not have possibly posted this 9,000 word essay on a blog. This connection was much longer, it could have. And so that's additional information which is visible, even though the content is encrypted, the quantity of traffic is not. And so that may be useful to you as the attacker. So to determine how hard this is, we have to know how many Tor connections happen over a given period of time. And the Tor folks don't keep statistics on this. It's a distributed network with volunteer operators distributed around the world. So no one has any good number on how many Tor connect. Well, the Tor people don't have a good number. I suspect strongly that the Chinese do have a good number. And I focus on the Chinese because they're a relatively easily understood, technologically savvy attacker. Some of the other countries that we think about are less technologically savvy. They buy less technology, they have less money to buy the technology. They have less money to employ expensive consultants to teach them how to do these things. And these are things that we believe they understand. You know, I'm not giving away any state secrets here, contrary to what some introductions may have said. So how many Tor connections happen? How many of them go to blogging sites? You can actually discover that really easily. Just set up a Tor node yourself, advertise it as an exit node, and count connections going to blogging sites. And then you'll have a very rough guess at how many of them overall, because Tor connections are pretty random. You'll get a sample, and you can learn from that sample. So I don't want to attach numbers to how easy or hard this is, but I believe it's easier than it should be. It is substantially easier than it should be. And so some hacking projects that will make it harder. If we wrote a blog post editor that ran in a web browser, and that editor, at the end of your post, put in a pad, so that instead of posting a 400-byte post, you would always be posting a kilobyte. Instead of posting 1,100 bytes, you'd be posting 2048 bytes. Then the posts would be a more standard size. And because they're a more standard size, it becomes so harder to do the correlation. And that's a reasonably easy thing to do. It would be great if we had something that ran in a web browser, JavaScript, or simply dynamic HTML-driven editor that would append things to a post. I think you need JavaScript. I hope someone can cleverly prove me wrong. I'm a big fan of using JavaScript for this sort of thing because it means I don't have to install software. I may not be able to install software if I'm at a cafe. And so having it run completely in the web browser in Java and JavaScript in some interpreted language is a good thing. Making it internationalization friendly, so we can easily change the buttons to be in local languages. That would be cool. Making it automatically post via Tor. And that's a whole other thing. You know, right now, Tor requires a client installation. If we could get away from the client installation and have a Java-driven connection, then you could do this all by showing up at a cafe, downloading a bunch of code, and yes, there's problems with it. Yes, it's possible to replace the code. Yes, it's possible to Trojan it, but that may be better, right? And this goes back to the question of what do governments actually do? What are they capable of? Can they execute an SSL man-in-the-middle attack? Well, it's likely that the Chinese government has inserted its own certificates into most browsers in China. That if you go to a cafe, the government has a certificate and they can produce a certificate that looks exactly like the one that you expected. They thus could do a man-in-the-middle, but it requires work, and I'll come back a little bit to government work required. So that would be one cool hacking project. Another interesting one that I think would be very valuable would be to create a plugin for WordPress that changes how quickly your posts show up on the internet, that pulls them together so that a number of posts show up at a blogging server and they come out in random order sometime later, right? Because we talked about using the time that someone sat down and using the time that the post showed up as being closely correlated. You break that close correlation, you make the attacker's job harder, and that's a good thing. A lot of times people who are new to anonymity talk about delay for that function. It turns out that delay is not actually what you want. Timing is vulnerable to normalization. If you simply add a time delay to every post, I can figure out what the average time delay is. I can subtract that. I can figure out what the variation is. So I can do statistical normalization on a delay. Now, if you pool, and you can think of a pool like a bucket, where posts get dropped into the bucket, and every now and then the bucket will overflow, and some posts will come out and be put onto the website. Now that's vulnerable to an active attack. If I'm trying to flood the bucket with messages, messages will come out and I can see what's been put in the bucket to, again, some statistical confidence. I have a dramatic preference for making my attacker go active. If my attacker has to reveal himself, if my attacker has to actually write code and interact with me, intelligence agencies hate doing that. They They really don't like exposing their activities. They don't like exposing their interests. They don't like exposing their techniques. And so that makes it doubly expensive for them, which, as the defender in this case, I like. And so cooling is better security-wise, it's better economics-wise. And a WordPress plugin would not be all that hard to write. There's code in Mixmaster, there's code in Mixminion, which performs cooling for these remailer networks. It would be pretty easy to adapt. It's a cool project. You could get yourself some press and attention and love from the world, and you could help people out. So I said I would return to this. That hosting isn't the only issue. I talked about the Adopt a Chinese Blog Nerd project. In talking to Iranian bloggers, getting RSS into email, one of the more popular Iranian bloggers, Hussein Darash, I mispronounced his last name, I apologize, Hussein, says he's got about 6,000 daily readers via the web and about 10,000 via email. Because the Iranian government monitors email less than they block websites. So having the ability to send RSS out to email would make his life easier. It would save him the double posting that he does now. Once to the web, once in an email. In a lot of places, mobile phones are much more powerful than they are in North America. They have web browsers, they have SMS. What about piping out posts via SMS to a distribution channel so that people can read them on their mobile phones? Sort of like podcasting with a device that people have. Posting RSS to Usenet. And then one that I came up with because it's that sort of conference. What if you start sending blog posts at random to laser printers and photocopiers in these places? You know, laser printers and photocopiers tend to be really poorly secured. They tend to be running unpatched copies of like Win98 or something. And if you do pen testing, you know they're a great way to explore a network. Well, what if you turn that into an active thing and have information that's otherwise hard to get in the country start coming out of these things? It might be an interesting idea. People would probably go to jail for it or worse. So I don't encourage you to actually do that, right? We call them repressive regimes for a reason. But I do encourage you to think creatively, to talk to people who are in these situations and say, how can I get information to you? How can we help? And to look at the situation as one that will respond well. People want to communicate. They want to be out there and talking to each other. They want to know what's happening in the world. You know, we come to conferences not only to learn, also to socialize. So as you think creatively, do consider the risks. I would strongly discourage anyone from spamming Chinese fax machines with subversive material, from spamming their laser printers. But I would encourage you to not think in only the ways that I have thought, but to think about new things that might help. So really it's about people communicating, wanting to help people communicate, wanting to help people do what they would like to do. And that's really, I believe, one of those core values that we should be providing to people around the world, is showing them that, yeah, we think you should be able to speak your mind. We think you should be able to talk about what you'd like to talk about, to communicate with who you'd like to communicate, and to do so without fear. And that's what the project is about, and we'd like some help. So, we have a wiki. There are lots of wikis around that help with these things. The circumvention.net is a new one. The goal is to provide a list of resources around. Ours is focused on some of the technology. We do ask you to sign up. We don't care who you sign up as. It's to keep wiki spam away. We have a very small mailing list, and I have an email address for this project. And again, we're looking for help, we're looking for volunteers. So, any questions, any comments?
You talked a lot about cryptographic tools. You also mentioned that you're worried about the use of those tools being seen as a negative activity that you can't use for yourself. What do you feel the role of steganography is in this?
It's a good, very good question. What's the role of steganography? There are a whole bunch of trade-offs that someone choosing a tool set has to make. Some of the more important trade-offs you have to make are client versus clientless, are the speed with which you get a result. So the client issue is, if I have a copy of a steganographic tool in China, or if I have a copy of PGP in Minnesota, that may be considered evidence of my guilt. And the Minnesota case was one that came out a couple of weeks ago, where a person who had been repeatedly accused of child molestation had a copy of PGP, had a copy of the relevant statutes on his computer, and that was used in his sentencing in a child molestation case in Minnesota about a month ago, maybe less. So choosing to have tools on your computer maybe is something you don't want to do. The timeliness versus usability of these anonymity systems is a really hard trade-off to make. The more time I can take, the more mixing I can do, the more pooling I can do, the more defensive things I can do around the post. They make it really hard to tell whether or not your post was successful. One of the reasons I like the idea of a pooling system in WordPress is because it allows me to send an acknowledgement immediately that, yes, we have your post, it will show up sometime later, we promise. If I send it out via a system which is steganographic, say I leak 2 bits a minute over DNS, then it's not until all of those minutes have passed that I can give you an acknowledgement. If the computer crashes in the middle, I may lose the transmission. If my receiver goes away, I may lose the transmission. So steganography is very powerful, but it requires having an acceptance that what you just did may take a while to show up. So it's a trade-off to be made. I'd like to understand first if the police are capable of monitoring the internet and generating the sort of database that they need to attack a system that works in real time. Once we do that, we can make a better choice about something like steganography. We can help people make better choices about steganography.
Is it illegal for citizens of the U.S. or Canada to aim at people in other countries and bring the laws into their countries?
Is it illegal for people in the U.S. To aid and abet someone in another country to break the law in that country? I'm not a lawyer. It is probably illegal in China for me to give this speech.
I think it depends on the law and whether there's a relevant there.
It depends on the law and what?
It usually depends on if there's any relevant law here that match.
There's 2 sets of laws that matter. There's one where I am, and there's one if I happen to go visit China. And it's probably not against the law in a Western nation to help people in other countries in these ways. It is. You are probably violating the same set of laws that the people you're helping are in the country where you're helping them.
It also depends if there's a treaty between different nations.
It does depend if there's a treaty, yes.
Some nations you can extradite people without showing any proof.
Most-
Between the UK and the US.
Yes, the question of extradition without proof is a very important one. Most of the mutual legal assistance treaties that I'm aware of require what it is that you're being extradited for to be a crime in both places. And so, for example, when Americans would come to Canada during Vietnam, there was no law against draft evasion, and so people were not sent back to the United States. So again, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not going to give you legal advice, it's a really complicated question. Yeah?
Do you think anonymity can screw up confidence in the people who post drugs? For example, if someone is called Dr. Evil and he posts anything about SARS, I would probably laugh at it instead of taking it seriously.
Yeah, it's a really good question. Does anonymity diminish credibility? And the answer is yes. You have to build up credibility if you're going to blog anonymously. And again, it's a trade-off that some very courageous people have decided to blog under their real names. I believe there are a lot of others who would blog and take that hit in credibility in exchange for the increase in their personal safety. And so I'd like to provide people with a range of options that they can make that call for themselves, rather than saying, if you're going to blog, you're going to be easily detected. So.
I've seen many websites or forums did not store exit notes. So if you're using Tor,
Could you speak up just a little bit?
sorry, I have a website forums and stuff like this one, just filtering Tor exit notes. So basically, if you're using Tor, because there, you won't be able to do so. So my point is, if your system relies on Tor, it can limit the number of blogs and websites you will be able to use, and then make things more easier for people to blog those websites, prevent people from reading them. So, is there some reflection about Tor exit note advertising to prevent people from blocking those blogs, and so making people able to post everywhere?
So the question involves Tor exit nodes which are being blocked from some forums, from some IRC servers, and you from blogs to post to blogs, and again, you have this continuum. If I want to read blogs anonymously, even though I can't post to them, that may be okay. If I want to post to a blogging server that supports this, that may be okay. There may be other places where it's not, so it might be useful to have perhaps subversive Tor nodes, which are not advertised as being Tor nodes, that help people get out. The question is, how would you authenticate someone as being allowed to use those nodes? My general approach is, I see from the perspective of someone running a site, there are lots of anonymity technologies that spammers will use. That's life. You know, Tor provides better anonymity because it's in heavier use than a system that's in less use. So again, it's this trade-off of, if we invented our own system, then we might get less blocking and less anonymity with it. So it's again a trade-off that people will need to deal with. Yes? Right. So the question is, could we just assume a maximal threat model and defend against it? And the answer is defending against the maximal threat models is really hard. As in really, really hard, and when I was with Zero Knowledge Systems, we got to the point where we said, we don't believe we can defend against some of these maximal threat models. So what we're doing by threat modeling is looking for places where the trade-offs that they make allow us to make trade-offs, and also the maximal threat models require more software, more training, and are easier to make mistakes using. So by constraining the threat model to the current reality, we allow ourselves to spend more time on translation, on usability, and we can deploy something for people sooner than if we focused on a maximal threat model. The long-term goal is absolutely to have tools that deal with the maximal threat model however best we can, and to educate people over limits. But in the meantime, we'd like to do something. Other questions? No? Well, thank you very much. Thank you for being up this early in the morning.